Welcome back, everybody. I am Ryan Maybee with Rieger Company, and we are back here in the Hey Hey Club for Barely Enough, our monthly live YouTube series. And tonight we are going to be talking about making and drinking one of my all-time favorite cocktails, the Sazerac. Sazerac is a cocktail that is really, truly very special to me. It's just one of the most iconic and influential cocktails of all time, with a really rich history and some really fun little anecdotes that influenced me personally over the years as a bartender. So I am wearing the hat tonight. We're talking about New Orleans. Sazerac comes from New Orleans, and we are also 1 week away from Tales of the Cocktail, the annual world's largest cocktail festival held down in New Orleans that will be kicking off next week at this time. So perfect timing to be talking about a Sazerac and thinking about New Orleans. So the history of the Sazerac. The Sazerac, it has kind of a murky history to some extent, but I guess all cocktails do, more or less. We definitely know that it originated in New Orleans, but it's not so far removed from just the original cocktail, like the first cocktail ever invented, which now we kind of know more or less as the old-fashioned. But the original cocktail really consists of 4 key ingredients: spirits, sugar, water, and bitters. That is the formula behind a cocktail, and the Sazerac really is that, with 1 or 2 minor deviations from that, but it is one of the originals. The Sazerac was founded probably around 1838 in New Orleans in the Sazerac Coffee House. It was created, we believe, by a gentleman named Antoine Peychaud, who created Peychaud's bitters. And if you're a bartender or have even a loose affiliation with cocktails, you've probably heard of Peychaud's bitters, kind of the counterpart to Angostura. Angostura is probably the most famous bitters ever created, with the bright yellow cap and the label that doesn't fit. But that bitters has like really concentrated, dark, heavy notes of baking spice, cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, things like that. Peychaud's is brighter. There's like a lot of orange, but there's also a very distinctive note of star anise, which is what's going to complement the Sazerac more than anything else. So this might be the most famous cocktail that calls for Peychaud's, and if you're going to make a Sazerac properly, you cannot do it without Peychaud's. There's no substitute for Peychaud's bitters. It was created by Antoine Peychaud. Antoine Peychaud was a pharmacist in what we now know today as Haiti in the early 1800s. He was a French pharmacist who relocated from Haiti to New Orleans during the Haitian Revolution around 1832, and he founded his apothecary in the French Quarter of New Orleans, where he sold his bitters, and that's really what he was known for, was his concentration of bitters, and they were considered to be medicinal in use. They were meant to cure a wide range of ailments and sicknesses. But what we ultimately learned was that it became known as a cocktail ingredient. And that's because a lot of the guys back then, a lot of the people back then that were using this, they were adding it to their mixture of spirit and sugars to kind of balance it out, make it a little bit, make the booze a little bit easier to go down. And that was kind of the origin of the Sazerac cocktail. Now, the Sazerac cocktail would have originally most likely have been cognac at that time, 1840s, 1850s. It was probably cognac. But while it became popularized under cognac at the time, by 1885, what happened in France is known as phylloxera. There was this widespread disease that infected all of the vines throughout France that killed a lot of the grapes for wine as well as for making cognac. And so there became a cognac shortage in the United States around that time. Now, it just so happens that simultaneously the American whiskey movement was gaining momentum. There was a lot of production, and a lot of the shipments of rye whiskey were making their way down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans. And so that region became flooded with rye whiskey, and people just started subbing in their rye whiskey when they had a little bit of trouble finding a bottle of cognac. And so the Sazerac, while it might have started out as a cognac cocktail, eventually transitioned into a rye cocktail, which is what we know today. Now, the Sazerac company, which had that Sazerac Coffee House on Royal Street in the French Quarter, they actually trademarked. The Sazerac cocktail became so popular that by 1900 they trademarked the name Sazerac, and it's to this day one of the very few cocktails that actually has a trademark name to it, which really kind of codifies the recipe and the ingredients and what goes in it. Furthermore, fast forward all the way to 2008, and New Orleans named the Sazerac cocktail as the official cocktail of New Orleans. And so now it is written in stone, it is living history, it is an integral part of the New Orleans experience. So next time you get down to New Orleans, there's a number of places that make a good Sazerac, but I would recommend checking out Jewel of the South. Peychaud's Bar, right in the middle of the French Quarter, is a really great place to have a Sazerac, and you should be able to find it widespread all over the city. So I did mention that the Sazerac cocktail being more or less the original cocktail of spirits, sugar, water, and bitters with the key notable differences. The main one is absinthe, and so a lot of people think about absinthe and there's this mystique around it of being hallucinogenic or having all these properties. The reality is that absinthe is a French after-dinner liqueur that's made from wormwood, green anise, fennel, and some other spices, but it doesn't really have any of those psychoactive properties as people talk about. It was more or less ahead of the federal prohibition on all alcohol. It was kind of used as more or less the thing that the temperance movement held up as saying, this is what we're targeting. It was kind of the poster spirit for the temperance movement because it was very high in alcohol to begin with. And so people just sort of like use that as the means for more or less demonizing all alcohol. So by 1910, 1912, absinthe became not only illegal in the United States, but it was illegal in a lot of different parts of the world. That all changed back in 2007 when finally we kind of came to our senses and said, you know what, it's kind of silly to have this really traditional, historic French and Swiss liqueur illegal, so the ban was lifted on it, and now today you can get really good quality absinthe here in the United States, and that's an ingredient, a key ingredient in the making of a Sazerac. So let's make one. Let's make a Sazerac. So the process with making a Sazerac, it's one of my favorite drinks to make because the process is so specific. You know, we talk a lot about the difference between stirring a cocktail or shaking a cocktail. This takes that a little bit further even. It's really a beautiful presentation and process that takes patience. And if you watch a bartender make a really perfect Sazerac, it's one of the coolest experiences you'll have sitting at a bar. It's really, really fun. The absinthe plays a minor but important role in the cocktail itself. You really just want to rinse the glass because it's so strong. It's about 140 proof, and it has all those really intense flavors of star anise and licorice and wormwood and things like that. You don't want to use too much, and it's really easy to go overboard with it. So you want to rinse the glass. Now there are a lot of different methods and techniques to rinsing a glass, but I'm going to show you my favorite one because this is another drink where you want to chill the glass ahead of making the drink as well. So what you want to use is a rocks glass, like this one here. If you have a really thin glass, thin-walled rocks glass, it works best. It's going to conduct the temperature a little bit better. But you want to take that rocks glass and fill it with pebble ice if you happen to have it. And then I like to take the absinthe and use a fair amount. This is one of those situations where you can use just a little bit and you can kind of quickly swirl it around the glass, or you can do what I'm doing here and you can kill two birds with one stone, and you can put ice in the glass and then put a significant amount of absinthe in the glass and let it just kind of sit there, and we're going to set that aside. That's the first step that we're going to take in making this cocktail. Next, we're basically making an old-fashioned. It's really not so much different. What I like to do with this, though, I would say most bartenders today are probably going to use rye whiskey, and they're going to use 2 ounces. But since it has that history with cognac, I really like making this a split base. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that 2 ounces of base spirit and we're going to split it between rye and cognac. So we're going to do an ounce of rye. Obviously, in this case, we're using Rieger Bottle and Bond Rye 100 proof. And then we're gonna do an ounce of a really nice cognac. These two are gonna balance each other out in a few different ways. One, you've got a really, really spicy kind of floral quality with the rye whiskey, and it's 100 proof. And then with the cognac, you've got this sort of delicate, floral, fruity sweetness to cognac, and it's only 80 proof. And so when you marry them in equal parts, it's really they're gonna dance together beautifully in the cocktail. We're also going to then, historically, you would probably take a sugar cube, and you would douse the sugar cube with the bitters and maybe a little bit of water. But in today's bartending world, you've probably got simple syrup behind the bar. The thing I don't like about using a sugar cube is that it's really hard to get it fully disintegrated. Even once you get done making the drink, you might have a little graininess. So I just think it's best to use an actual simple syrup. And then finally, we're going to do a few dashes of the Peychaud's bitters that I talked about earlier. It's really, really important to this cocktail. Now, I had a question come through about, is there anything you can use instead of absinthe? No. It's another one of those ingredients that's just so vital to making this cocktail the proper way. There's nothing wrong with experimenting with other ingredients. You could experiment with something like, say, genepi or green chartreuse or perhaps some other similar style of liqueurs. The problem is that in most cases, they're not going to be as high in alcohol. They're not going to have quite the same flavor profile. And so while you might actually make a pretty good cocktail out of it, it's not going to be the true Sazerac. And what we're focusing on right now is making a true Sazerac. And so I do recommend using a real legitimate absinthe, which there aren't a whole lot out there, but you should be able to find it. Okay, so in our mixing glass here, we've got rye, cognac, simple syrup, and Peychaud's bitters. Next thing we're gonna do is fill it with ice and give it a stir. And I've probably talked about a lot in the past about the difference between shaking and stirring. This is definitely a cocktail that you don't want to shake. Any spirits only cocktail, so if you're talking just booze, simple syrup, bitters, liqueurs, whatever, that kind of thing, you want in the cocktail to have that consistency, that silkiness of the actual liqueur itself or the liquor itself, and not have it cloudy. When you shake a drink, you're not just getting it cold and diluting a little bit, you're actually introducing oxygen into it. And so when you shake really hard back and forth, you're introducing air bubbles into the drink. And so when you pour it, it's going to be cloudy and a little bit bubbly. And you don't want that in a cocktail like this. So an old fashioned, a Manhattan, a Sazerac, anything that kind of falls into that family, you want to make sure that you're just stirring it gently so that you're getting the temperature down and you're getting some dilution to some extent, but it's maintaining its consistency and texture and mouthfeel. Finally, I do like to add just a little bit more ice to the top. Now what we're gonna do over here with our absinthe, this is a kind of next level. So if you see a bartender do this, they know what they're talking about. I like to have it in the glass with the ice like this so that you can strain it off. A lot of people have never tasted absinthe by itself, and this is a really great opportunity to educate them on exactly what that is. So strain it out of the glass. You're going to get the coating inside the glass. Dump out the ice. It's nice and cold, right? And then we're just going to strain into that nice frosty cold rocks glass. And you'll notice we're not pouring that over ice. So this style of presentation and service is known as being served down. You've probably heard of serving a cocktail up or straight up, right? What that means is chilled and then up in a martini glass. Down, which is, Sazerac is easily the most well-known cocktail that's served that style, is chilled, but it's served sans ice in a rocks glass. So we've got another question about, can you swap out the flavor of bitters for the cocktail? Again, the same thing as with the absinthe, you can. But Peychaud's being, that the Sazerac was created by Antoine Peychaud using Peychaud's bitters, and it has a very, very distinctive flavor profile with the orange and the star anise and the different botanical and spice makeup of it. You can tinker with other brands and other styles, but you're not going to get that flavor profile. Peychaud's any bitters really is a highly concentrated flavor, right? It's a maceration, a very heavy maceration that really concentrates those flavors, and that's why when you're adding just a few dashes here and there, it really changes the overall flavor profile of the cocktail itself. Now we're just about done. We've poured it into our chilled rocks glass down, and now we're going to garnish it with a lemon peel. So in this case, we're going to take our lemon peel and just express a little bit of lemon oil over the top of the cocktail and make sure that you get it in the glass. I also kind of like to run the lemon peel around the rim of the glass so that you get a little bit of flavor of it when you pick it up and take a drink. Now here's another thing that ends up being kind of hotly debated in the bartender world. Do you put the garnish in the drink or do you throw it away? Personally, I don't mind at all if the garnish is left in the cocktail. It does not bother me, and I feel like it actually kind of extracts some of the lemon flavor a little bit over time as the drink warms up. However, a lot of people are very, very particular about casting the garnish aside, and I did see someone recently, I'm not sure where I saw this video, but he called that process of garnishing the drink and then casting it aside as ghosting the cocktail. And I just thought that was a really cool term. I hadn't seen that before. So today we're just gonna ghost the cocktail with the lemon oil to get that aroma. And if you're making it right now in front of yourself, you can smell it. Like even a couple feet away from the drink, you can smell that lemon oil. It's really pronounced and it makes a huge difference, especially when you take your first sip. So you take your first sip, cheers. And the first thing that you get is that lemon. Like it's, before you even put it to your lips, you've got that lemon, and it impacts the flavor of the cocktail itself. Where can I get that rye whiskey? So, Rieger's Bottled & Bond Rye. Thank you for asking. It should be pretty available here in the Kansas City area, Missouri, Kansas. That's where we're based out of. But we distribute in 27 states. It is 6 years old. We bottle and release it once a year. We actually have our next release coming out in about a month. So August 16th is going to be the release of our next batch of Bottled & Bond straight rye, and we are going to be distributing it around the country. So you just kind of have to look for it. Check our website. It is available, and you can definitely find it. Reasonably priced, makes a beautiful Sazerac, beautiful Manhattan, and a ton of other cocktails. But there you have it. There's a Sazerac. Now, why did I do this here in this really cool little cordial glass? So if I'm bartending, if you're sitting here at my bar and you ask me to make a Sazerac, this is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to then present it to you like this. And if you've never had one before, you might have all kinds of questions, right? And you might want to know, like, what is absinthe? So using that absinthe right there, not only to rinse the glass and to provide that added layer of flavor in the cocktail itself, but instead of just throwing it out, I could just throw it down the drain. I think a lot of times that's what happens. Pour it into a little cordial glass like this so that people can taste it by itself. So you can taste it and get to experience it. You also might notice here, what's really cool about this is here's what it looked like. First time, crystal clear, beautiful green color, right? And now look at it, it's like this milky, opaque color. That process is called lushing. And what that means is you're talking about a botanical liqueur here that has such a heavy concentration of those ingredients, and the color comes mostly from green anise, and it's a post-distillation maceration of green anise that gives it that color. So there's oils in the spirit itself which give it that color, and then when you dilute it, when it interacts with water, it activates some of those oil molecules and turns it this like kind of milky, opaque color, and it's called lushing. This is the thing that like really made absinthe back around the turn of the 20th century in Paris and, you know, all over Europe, but mainly Paris. The thing of legends, like all the artists and writers and, you know, painters and poets, they all drank absinthe, and a lot of them talked about sitting in these Parisian cafes sipping on absinthe and how magical it was and wonderful it was. Or there's lots of paintings from that time period depicting cafes with absinthe on the table and this kind of really cool color, because nothing else really did that. That was really unique to that spirit at the time, and it became huge. It was a huge part of that like bohemian culture around the turn of the 20th century, and they sold more. There were more cases of absinthe sold in France in the early 1900s than beer. It was that popular, and so it's kind of a shame that it became illegal several years later, and a lot of the companies that produced absinthe back then went out of business. One of the largest, Pernod, did not go out of business. Fortunately, they stayed alive and they were able to bring back their original recipe, and that's what's widely available today is the Pernod absinthe. But this color has been something that the color, the flavor, the overall experience of watching it loosh and change and evolve is something that has inspired artists and painters for well over a century. I will say that drinking absinthe like that, like just straight, it's the first time you've ever had it. If you've never had that before, it can be a little bit like, wow, oh my God, what's happening here? It's intensely bitter, right? But the dilution helps quite a bit because it's about 140 proof to start. Historically, you would do this before the Sazerac was really popularized using absinthe. You would drink it just like this, but with a sugar cube. And in those cafes, they would have these specific spoons that were made for absinthe that would sit over the top of the glass with a sugar cube on it, and you would slowly drip ice cold water over the sugar cube, and it would drain down into the glass, filling it up with water, slowly changing that color and adding some sweetness to kind of balance it out. It's really, really a very, very cool thing. So I mentioned that the Sazerac is a very special cocktail to me personally. When I first started bartending back in 1999, I worked at this really amazing high-end steakhouse here in Kansas City called Pierpont's at Union Station. And we had this gentleman, this older gentleman who was probably in his late 60s, early 70s at the time, as kind of a consulting partner for the business. And he was an old school cocktail guy and just an amazing human being when it came to hospitality and all those things. And so in 1999, at the height of like the Cosmopolitan and apple martini and chocolate martini craze, he wanted to bring back these classic cocktails. And so he had this list of some popular old cocktails dating back to the pre-Prohibition era that we advertised as like our happy hour specials. Now, unfortunately, the idea was great, but we were never really trained on how to make those drinks properly. And so one day, only a few weeks into opening the restaurant, and we were really busy, but I was really curious about some of these old cocktails, and I saw this one listed on the happy hour list, Sazerac, and I had no idea how to make it. And so I went to my manager and I said, how do we make a Sazerac? What is that? And he said, I don't know. And he was the bar manager, but he got out a book, probably not a very good one, and he went to Sazerac and he sort of walked me through the process of making it, although it was not like this at all. We did not do the proper technique and presentation. He actually had me grab a rocks glass full of ice. We didn't have sugar cubes at the time, so I had to like tear open a packet of sugar and put it in there. I don't think we had Peychaud's bitters, and so I used Angostura. And then this is before absinthe was legalized again, and so we didn't have absinthe. What he had me use was Pernod Pastis, which is sort of a cheap knockoff of absinthe that's much lower in alcohol and much sweeter. And so he had me pour this like really poorly made old-fashioned with Ango sugar packets and Old Overholt rye whiskey over ice, and then had me float the Pernod on top, and we both took a sip of this and we're like, oh my God, this is so bad. It was one of the worst things I'd ever tasted. And I was like, that's terrible. He goes, yeah, don't sell that. I'm like, I won't. Well, like 2 years passed, right? And no one ever came into my bar and asked me for a Sazerac again until one day this guy did. This guy came in and sat at my bar, and he asked me for a Sazerac, and he was looking at the back bar, which is beautiful 20-foot tall rolling library ladder shelf system of booze that had everything. And at the time, there was sort of a knockoff absinthe called Grand Absente, which contained all of the ingredients except for what was thought to be the psychoactive ingredient, wormwood. So it was a suitable knockoff at the time. And so he saw that we had rye whiskey, we had Peychaud's bitters at the time, we had this knockoff of absinthe, and he asked me if I knew how to make a Sazerac, and I was really taken aback. I'm like, oh my God, I haven't heard that word in like 2 years. I said, yeah, but you don't want that. That's really bad. And he just started laughing. He goes, let me walk you through how I would like you to make it. And so this customer walked me through step by step this process, more or less. At that point, I hadn't even stirred a cocktail in my life. We had one of those old bar spoons with the red tip. And so I clumsily stirred it and everything, and he had me serve it in the rocks glass down with no ice. And I know that I didn't necessarily make it all that well, but I got it done. I did exactly what he asked and paid really close attention. And then he said, go ahead, try it. And so I tried it, and it was so profoundly different from that first one that I made. And it was the first time that I ever really noticed and realized that the process of making a cocktail can really have a dramatic impact on the end result. So it's not just the ingredients, but it's the actual technique and the process. And it was that experience, and I'm so glad that a guest took the time to walk me through this. It was that experience that caused me to kind of look into, more intricate forms of mixology and making cocktails and dig a little bit deeper. I realized that there was more beneath the surface. It was really a profound experience. And then a few years later, in 2005, I went to this really famous bar in New York City in the Lower East Side called Milk and Honey. And at that point, I thought I knew everything about cocktails, or I thought I was getting there. But I was really lucky to get to Milk and Honey in 2005. And the owner, Sasha Petrosky himself, made me a Sazerac, and it was just mind-blowing. The attention to detail and the level of quality and the care, and this step of doing the absinthe in the glass next to the drink was really something amazing. While we're talking about absinthe, we, Rieger Company, do make absinthe. In fact, this one that I use in this cocktail is ours. It's not something that we've sold, though, outside of the distillery. We've had it as a limited edition availability in our tasting room and in our gift shop. But it's not something that we've distributed or sold elsewhere. But it is something that I think we're going to maintain and keep available. Our master distiller, Nathan Perry, and I have been talking about doing absinthe since the very beginning, since we launched the company back in 2014. Absinthe is something that we wanted to do. And as Nathan has learned through making gin with Tom Nickel, he's really learned a lot about how to treat botanicals in the distillation process, and he's put a lot of time and thought into learning how to make an absinthe. I want to say this one that he did and we finally ended up bottling was probably like the 25th or 30th iteration of his absinthe, and it's phenomenal. I love using it in cocktails. I love drinking it by itself. It's not even overly bitter, like even without the sugar, it's just wonderful. So yeah, we do make an absinthe, and you can get it here at the distillery. Trying to think, it might be all I've got. If there are no other questions, I would say that's a wrap. And thank you for joining us. This has been Barely Enough. In the words of Mark Twain, too much of anything can be bad for you, but too much whiskey is barely enough. Like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, and I'll see you next time.